I'll organize this as a regular class in terms of timing, so it will be 2 hours with a break in the middle. If you have questions, if you have points to raise during my exposition, just raise your hand and interrupt me. You don't have to wait for questions and answers at the end, because there might not be time for that. So don't feel any inhibition to raise your questions or points as you feel them popping up. Okay, what's this class going to be about? Israel and the Self-Defense Revolution was my original title, it still is. But I now put it down to one case. Originally I was planning to do several cases, but in the end I decided to focus on the 6 Days War, because as I was preparing for this class and reading up on recent literature, I started to understand how central this case is to illustrate what I would call, what others have called, the Self-Defense Revolution, which is the extension and the expanded use and the more and more frequent use of self-defense as a legal doctrine and as a legal justification for the use of force by states. Israel is, of course, one of the more military active states from recent history. Since its foundation in 1947, it was engaged in different state-to-state wars. Of course, there's also the ongoing conflict with the Palestinians within the territories of Israel and Palestine, the old mandate territories from before the establishment of Israel as a state in 1947. But that alone, of course, the fact that Israel is one of the states that was engaged in the largest number of interstate conflicts since World War II, and at the same time, of course, is also engaged in conflict with the Palestinians in and around the occupied territories in its own territories, makes it a very important state to study the practice of, to see how not only its own state practice with relation to the justification, the legal arguments to justify use of force have evolved, but also to see how other states have reacted, particularly in debates in the United Nations Security Council or in the United Nations General Assembly, with relation to what is known in United Nations euphemistic speech, the conflict in the Middle East. That's the standard term with which it's referred to since at least the 1960s, and particularly that systematically since the 1970s. Now, the 6 Days War, as you know, was a conflict that took place in the beginning of June 1967, so 50 years ago. It lasted indeed from the 5th to the 10th of June, which is 6 days, as you can count out. But this is, of course, the conflict that led to Israel occupying large tracts of land, more particularly, of course, the West Bank, Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Desert, most of which, or all of which actually, which was returned finally in April 1982 to the Republic of Egypt. In international law, it is also a cause célèbre, a very often quoted case, namely a case of anticipatory self-defense. In non-legal terms, self-defense before the armed attack against which you defend has actually commenced. There's the anticipation, either directly or somewhat more remotely, of an armed attack to take place, and under this estimation, under this reading of facts, a state then resorts to force, claiming that it's acting in anticipation of an armed attack, so committing an act under Article 51 of the United Nations the United Nations Charter of 1945 that allows individual and collective self-defense without, of course, opening the door in any way literally or in another way to anticipatory self-defense. So to the non-lawyers among you, self-defense is a well-established right. A state can resort to force when it is attacked, when it is victim of an armed attack, which has already started. This is a well-established right under current international law. Anticipatory self-defense before, but in the anticipation of an attack, is not a well-established right. It's a highly contested right, or non-right. It's a highly contested claim towards the right, which the vast majority of writers on international law reject, and which states over the Cold War and after the Cold War have been generally reluctant to claim and reluctant to, and that is actually, put it mildly, generally states have not accepted it, have rejected it, and very few states have claimed it, very few states have actually defended it, although in the 21st century, particularly in the context of the so-called Bush Doctrine, it has generated much more attention and somewhat more support than it used to have before. In this context, The 6 Days War is often quoted as the mother of anticipatory self-defenses or acts of anticipatory self-defense during the Cold War or in the Charter period, because allegedly Israel launched its attack on Egypt and Syria in the morning of the 5th of June by launching its air force against the Syrian air force and against the Egyptian air force, and by invading the Sinai with its armored units in anticipation of an imminent attack by the Egyptian and Syrian forces, the Egyptian land and air forces to the south, the Syrians to the north. And indeed, in many textbooks of international law, you can find reminiscences to the 6 Days War, in which it is said, with some nuance or without some nuance, that this was a case of anticipatory self-defense, was the case in the Cold War of anticipatory self-defense. Thomas Frank, a New York-based international lawyer and often advisor to American administrations, wrote in his classical text from 2002, although Israel also based its justifications on actual defense against such aggressive acts by Egypt as the closure of the Strait of Tiran, its words and actions clearly asserted a right to anticipatory self-defense against an imminent armed attack. It is difficult not to conclude that the United Nations Security Council members gave credence to this latter argument, since none of its resolutions spoke of the return of captured territory or censured Israeli action despite urgent demands to that effect by the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies. Israel's attack on Egypt was in anticipation of an armed attack, not a reaction to it, because no armed attack had yet taken place, Frank assumes in 2002. Most states, on the basis of evidence available to them, did, however, apparently conclude that such an armed attack was imminent, was about to happen, that Israel had reasonably surmised that it stood a better chance of survival of the attack if the attack were preempted, and that therefore, in the circumstances, it had not acted unreasonably. So here Frank says Israel indeed used force first. It did not defend itself against a state that had resorted to force first, but it did so under the reasonable estimation that an imminent attack was about to take place, and that its chances for survival, being a tiny country with little strategic depth, once an attack is successfully launched, there's not much territory to defend, particularly if you take that east-west, so it had not acted unreasonably. This does not amount to an open-ended endorsement of a general right to anticipatory self-defense by the states of the world, but it does recognize that in demonstrable circumstances of extreme necessity, anticipatory self-defense may be a legitimate exercise of a state's right to assure its survival. May I draw your attention again to the first line? Although Israel also based its justifications on actual self-defense against such aggressive acts, meaning by Egypt as the closure of the Strait of Iran, its words and actions clearly asserted a right to anticipatory self-defense. He's a bit careful here. He doesn't say that Israel claimed to act under anticipatory self-defense, and indeed it did not in 1967. It only started doing that after 1972 in legal statements. It actually did not. But Frank says it was generally assumed that it acted under the reasoning that a Syrian-Egyptian attack was about to take place, and it had to forestall that by attacking first, so to assure its survival. And the members of the Security Council did not condemn Israel because they could live with that. So there's a lot of conjecture by Frank. I don't want to attack Frank, because by making it so nuanced, Frank is one of the most nuanced authors of recent years to talk about this case in these terms. You will find many textbooks that blatantly will say Israel claimed anticipatory self-defense and the world supported that. Frank is already more careful and closer to the actual facts. Israel did not claim that, at least not in official positions in the United Nations Security Council or the General Assembly, when during the conflict or shortly after the conflict they debated this. Markham Shaw, there's a 2017 edition, but I'm not yet the proud owner of that, so I will have to check whether he has changed his view. States have employed preemptive strikes in self-defense. By the way, Frank and Shaw are among the top 10 international lawyers of the last 20 years writing on the use of force, so this is not some marginal authors. Israel in 1967 launched a strike upon its Arab neighbors following the blocking of its southern port of Eilat and the conclusion of a military pact between Jordan and Egypt. This completed the chain of events precipitated by the mobilization of Egyptian forces on Israel's border and the eviction of United Nations peacekeeping forces from the area by the Egyptian president. It could, of course, also be argued that the Egyptian blockade itself constituted the use of force, thus legitimizing Israeli actions without the need for anticipatory conceptions of self-defense, especially when taken together with the other events. It is noteworthy that the United Nations, in its debates in the summer of 1967, apportioned no blame for the outbreak of fighting and did not condemn the exercise of self-defense by Israel. This paragraph is taken from the page in the standard textbook of international law by Malcolm Shaw, which is now in its 7th or 8th edition. This is the previous edition, the one but last edition. And there's an interesting evolution in his text. This is taken from the page, that deals with anticipatory self-defense. And he mentions the famous case. But if you read the text again, he never says that Israel claims anticipatory self-defense. He never claims that the states condoned it as being anticipatory self-defense in the Security Council, but he suggests it. And he says that the states condoned the actions of Israel because they understood them to be happening under an imminent threat of an Egyptian-Syrian attack, and that the states, for this reason, did not condemn Israel's first use of force, or the fact that Israel had, as the first state, resorted to force and massive force in attacking Egypt and Syria at the time. It didn't attack Jordan, by the way. Jordan shot first, and then the Israelis attacked Jordan again on the second day of the war. So that case was clearer. In the very first edition of Malcolm Shaw is more direct. Here he has watered it down. So he goes back from the, let's say, very generally held claim among international lawyers of the 70s, 80s, and 90s that this was a clear-cut case of anticipatory self-defense. Why? Why are they climbing down? Particularly Shaw is climbing down here. Because between 1910 and 1915, and this is after 2010 and 2015, quite some documents, archival documents, have been opened to the public by Israel, by the United States, by some other countries. But particularly the Israeli and United States documents are quite interesting, because now they show us almost the full story of what was actually done, what was actually thought, what was actually the basis on which Israel made its decision to go to war, what was actually the basis on which Egypt and Syria were preparing themselves for the event, and what was actually also the basis or the information on which the United States acted and other states acted during the war. I will unfold this as we go, but it has now become clear through the opening of these documents that the story is much more blurred, much more complex, much more difficult in the end than it was thought by international lawyers for a long time. And that indeed, although this is still very insightful as a case to speak about anticipatory self-defense or about the extent and expansion of self-defense in general, there is many things have been said and done over the last 40, 50 years that were not based on very good information or very accurate information. But I'm sure this is all quite sibilant until now. Another thing I want to draw your attention to, when lawyers speak about self-defense since at least the 1920s, 1930s, and when they speak about anticipatory self-defense, they often refer to the so-called Caroline incident as the mother of all cases of self-defense and or anticipatory self-defense, as the beginning of a customary right in international law, a law based on continuous state behavior, the claim that states over time have generally accepted a right to self-defense, and an incident that helps shed a light on the question whether this includes the right to resort to force before you're attacked, or whether you have to wait until the attack has actually occurred or taken place. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the details or the ins and outs of the Caroline incident. It is well called, it was an incident. In the end, it was a border incident between then British Canada and the United States. whereby there were rebels, that's a big word, active on the Canadian border, who were approvisioned with arms, food, and money by American supporters to the south of the border. The actual incident was the burning down of a smuggler ship on one of the Great Lakes between the United States and Canada by British-Canadian police forces or customs forces in an incident in which one man was killed. This led to a 5 years diplomatic correspondence between British and American diplomats, and in that correspondence at one point the British representative in the United States defined the right to self-defense as emerging from a necessity which is instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moments of deliberation. Meaning that when you would stretch the right of self-defense to the moment before the attack has occurred, the threat of the attack has to be an instant threat, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moments of deliberation. Hence the word imminent. The attack has to be imminent, and this is, let's say, the normally maximum interpretation of the right of self-defense that lawyers would give. But let's first go to the 6 Days War itself and the facts. First of all, a little bit of territorial history. Of course, you have the introduction class of at least those of you who are following this series about the history of the conflicts. But if you know a little bit about the conflict, you know, of course, that it really escalated in 1947. There was already quite a conflict in the 1930s, with, of course, also the Palestinian rebellion against the British forces that led to a very bloody quelling by the British forces of that. Then there was the armed conflict between the Jewish settlers and the British Mandate government, particularly at the end of World War II, leading in the end in a complex negotiation involving the embryonic United Nations and then the early United Nations institutions, or the just founded institutions, leading to the establishment and the declaration of independence of Israel, followed up by an international war between Israel and its Arab neighbors, including Iraq. Israel won that war, and at the end of that was a series of armistices, ceasefire agreements between Israel and Egypt, between Israel and Jordan, between Israel and Lebanon, between Israel and Syria, in which borders were recognized, temporary ceasefire lines, often with demilitarized zones, like between Syria and Israel in the north around the Golan Heights. So international lines were drawn, but in terms of ceasefire lines, often with left and right of the border, demilitarized zones that would later gain recognition as the international borders of the states of Israel with its Arab neighbors. It also was the period in which the West Bank was annexed by Jordan, by the Kingdom of Jordan, to its territory, that the Gaza was put by Egypt under temporary administration, while the Sinai, of course, was already Egyptian territory before, and just remained that. If we then quickly go through the history, a very important event, of course, to take into your mind or keep into your mind is the Suez Crisis of 1956. This is only 11 years before the 6 Days War. So the politicians and the military leaders that fought in the Suez Crisis were still very much there in 1967, and for them it was a tremendously important experience, particularly also informing the legal debates on the Israeli side. Why? Well, briefly rehearse the facts of the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis came, of course, as a consequence of the nationalization of the Suez Company by the Egyptian regime of President Nasser, Gamal Nasser, in the context of his pan-Arab nationalist strong standing against the Western former colonizing powers, particularly Britain and France. It led to a somewhat rough and tumble conspiracy between London and Paris on one side and the Israeli government on the other side, by which it was agreed that Israel would trigger a war with Egypt, invade towards the Suez Canal through the Sinai, and that French and British troops would intervene to separate the fighting forces and thus retake control over the Suez Canal. This all worked out brilliantly until Eisenhower, the American president, said stop. He intervened quite quickly, quite roughly, quite brutally, among others by threatening to sink the boat of the sterling, the pound, Eisenhower was furious, was livid with anger, particularly against the British, his closest ally, and the French for having organized this little scheme without his knowing. This at the exact moment of the Budapest or the Hungarian revolt against the Soviet Union, which derailed his whole tactic to try to strong stand against the Soviet Union, to convict them of their rough handling of the Hungarians, while two of his main allies were rough handling the Egyptians at the same time. He even threatened that in case of the escalation of the conflict and the drawing in of the Soviet Union, the United States would not support France and Britain, and he even let it be understood that the United States might even withdraw from Europe over this whole conflict. Now the Israelis took the lesson here that although they proved to be more military superior in 1956 than they had anticipated themselves, the Americans had not given them time to press their advantage. And that was a lesson that people like Rabin, who by 1967 was the commander-in-chief, later prime minister, later murdered, as you know, the commander-in-chief, the president of the chairman of the chief of staff of the Israeli army. This was a lesson that people like Rabin or Moshe Dayan, the famous tank commander, the patron of the Israeli army, as he liked to style himself at the time, really took in. If we ever go back to a war against Egypt and its allies, Egypt of course being by far the major Arab opponent of Israel, we will need time to press our advantage. If they attack us, or if we attack them, whatever the scenario, we'll need at least a week or so to press our advantage before the United States stop us, before the United Nations Security Council has a chance of stopping us. So this is a very important lesson from 1956 to the Israeli military, but of course, particularly at the time, Israeli military and political class are very much intertwined. So you may not, of course, exclude this calculation also from the minds of the political decision makers. In this context of the Suez crisis, and after this, the solution or the solving of the Suez crisis, Egypt temporarily blocks the Strait of Tiran. Let's go to a map. You have, of course, at the top of the Strait of Tiran, there where Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia almost touch upon one another, the important harbor of Aqaba on the Jordan side, and the important tourist resort now, but also harbor of Eilat on the Israeli side. Then there's a stretch of water which opens into the Red Sea, and this is the near Sharm el-Sheikh, of course also known from the Thomas Cook and other brochures these days, the so-called Strait of Tiran. This was already closed by the Egyptians before 1967, then after 1959 it was opened for traffic, and at that time Israel starts to develop a port, a harbor, a commercial harbor in what was used to be a fisher's village, Eilat, and builds its second most important harbor of Israel, the most important one being that of Haifa on the Mediterranean. It has some importance in oil import. Israel is of course almost 100% dependent on foreign oil for its energy provision. The vast majority of that goes through Haifa, through the Mediterranean. A very tiny drop also goes through Eilat, but it is of course part of the vital economic system of Israel, particularly, even maybe more in the public's eye than it's actually in reality. Another background to the conflict is that from 1965 onwards, Fatah, the lead organization within the Palestinian Liberation Organization of Yasser Arafat, starts its systematic attacks on Israel and on Israeli citizens and on Israeli territory, and escalates that. Most of these attacks at the time are launched from Syria. So Syria is its headquarters and Syria is its base, bringing of course constant military tension and incidents to abound between Israeli troops and Palestinians, between Israeli troops and Syrian troops in the border area around the Golan Heights. 1966 is also the year when the Ba'ath Party, with some allies, takes power in Syria. The Ba'ath Party, from which later in 1970 Assad's father Assad will arise and become the leader of Egypt. And quickly Syria starts to move away from its old allegiances to the west towards the Soviet Union. Egypt already has become more or less a Soviet ally since the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s particularly. Syria is following suit. So Israel is now surrounded by its two most important, most powerful Arab enemies, who are also now allies of the Soviet Union. That, to the contrary, leads to a ever closer relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv. Beginning of the Cold War in the 1940s, 50s, relationships between the United States, the relations between the United States and Israel were not so close as you may think. Israel had much more support from European states like, for instance, France, also for its armaments industry. Think of the nuclear development of Israel, which is mostly supported by France. The United States only starts really to come in the 60s, and then particularly even in the 70s after the victory in the 6 Days War. But by the 6 Days War, as you will see, Israel was already in the calculations of Washington. In the end, it is a power that holds up important Soviet allies in the Middle East, so we cannot afford Israel losing wars. And if they can press their advantage against Syria and Egypt, so much the better for us. But it's still very much cold calculations rather than the much closer personal relationships and alliances that we know from later years between Washington and Tel Aviv. In other words, Israel cannot count on the United States as it would be able to do in the 80s, 90s, and the 21st century. Other important events are that in November 1966, Egypt and Syria sign a treaty of alliance. No, that's the other one. I don't have the text here. In which they basically ally themselves to support one another in case of an Israeli attack. That doesn't really encourage Israel to the extent that it makes, of course, the calculation. If they want to attack us, they will claim that we attacked them first. So this is also as much an offensive alliance against us as a defensive alliance against Israel. And in the end, of course, Egypt and Syria do not recognize Israel to be a state at all. There is also a major incident on the 11th November of all dates 1966 in which Israeli troops raid into the West Bank in retaliation of a Palestinian, in their eyes, Palestinian attack. 3 Israeli soldiers have been killed on the Israeli side of the border by driving on a landmine. It is generally surmised that this landmine has been put there by Fatah, and they retaliate in reprisal by invading the village of Samu on the West Bank, killing some people there. Israel is convicted by the United Nations Security Council, condemned for that, under the allegation that this is not an act of self-defense, but an act of reprisal after the attack. Here, the United Nations Security Council very clearly holds to the interpretation that the right of self-defense begins when the attack begins and stops when the attack stops. And that this is an act of vengeance, of reprisal in legal terms, and not an act of self-defense. Today, most states would actually have a much more relaxed reading of such an occurrence than it was yet the case in this context in 1967. Over 1967 then, the tensions rise. There is an enhancing number of Palestinian incursions into Israel in Syria. There are more frequent shootouts between the Israeli and the Syrian army around the demilitarized zone. As Dayan would later concede in his memoirs, generally the Israelis would ask an Israeli farmer to drive his tractor in the neutral zone. The Syrians would shoot on the farmer, and then the Israeli army would shoot back. So these were basically provoked incidents on both sides. In many cases, the Syrians allowing the Palestinians to do attacks in Israel, and the Israelis allowing their farmers to farm land that they shouldn't farm, to settle, if you like, even in modern terms, well, not settling here, in lands that they shouldn't, according to the armistice agreements. A very important moment, and now this brings us within 3 weeks of the war. On the 13th of May of 1967, the Soviet ambassador in Cairo alerts the Egyptian government that they have information that Israel is massing troops against Syria. That Israel is concentrating tank brigades and tank divisions on the Syrian border, apparently set to invade Syria. This is not true. And it very quickly appears within hours and days that this is a fluke, that this is not true. But it causes a debate around Nasser in the Egyptian government that leads Nasser to show support for Syria. Even after, within hours, he learns that the Soviet report is a hoax, is a mistake. It's an honest mistake. It's not that the Soviets want to trigger a war or something like that. It's an honest mistake. But the debate has started within his government, among his allies, and at that point, Nasser apparently feels the need to very clearly indicate to the Arab world that as the champion of pan-Arab nationalism, as the strongest opponent and the most important and most motivated opponent against Israel, he will now support Syria. And for that reason he takes some measures which undoubtedly he considers to be a kind of diplomatic signal more directed towards Syria and his Arab allies than maybe to Israel, but steps that will be interpreted in Israel as threats and will be used by Israelis to reach the ominous decision of launching an attack on the 5th of June. What are these decisions? First, he decides to bring 20, then 30, then 50, then 80,000 men within the Sinai Desert. So Egypt moves troops towards the Israeli border and towards the demilitarized zone between Israel and Egypt, which is guarded by UN peacekeepers, the 16th of May. Secondly, 2 days later, he has the Minister of Foreign Affairs ask Utant, the Secretary General of the United Nations, to withdraw the peacekeepers from the demilitarized zone. At that time, he doesn't ask to withdraw them from Sharm el-Sheikh. But the general who is in command asks the Egyptian who comes to bring him the message, together with somebody from New York, from the United Nations, should I also withdraw them from Sharm el-Sheikh? And the Egyptian diplomat on his own says, yes, I think that is the intention. And the United Nations indeed decides to withdraw all its troops from the Sinai, including from Sharm el-Sheikh. Particularly this worries the Israelis because they see that as a preparation, and 2 days later or 3 days later, Egyptian troops move into Sharm el-Sheikh, their own territory, but replacing the peacekeepers. Israel sees this as an anticipation towards blocking the Strait of Tiran. And indeed, the 22nd of May, this is exactly what Nasser does. He announces the blockade of the Strait of Tiran for Israeli ships and for ships that are going to import oil and military material into the harbor of Eilat. Israel considers this to be a hostile act, an act of war, which in their reading would give them a right to self-defense, to defend themselves against their violation of their rights. I'm not going to go into the very intricate legal case of the Strait of Iran. There's many pros and cons to say whether this is a violation of international law or not, whether this constitutes an act of war or not, an armed attack or not, whether this triggers the right of self-defense for Israel or not. For instance, just to give you one example, is this a strait? A strait in international law is a narrow connection between two seas, between two international waters. Is this broad enough to constitute an international water? This is debated at the time. Another debate is Israel and Egypt are at war or not. Are they at war? Or does the ceasefire constitute enough of a peace to end the right for Egypt to make an act of war like the blocking of a strait? So there's a lot of legal debates that makes it clear to any legal advisor, including the legal advisor of Cairo and Tel Aviv, that you cannot make a very strong case before or against self-defense. In the end, the problem, if Israel wants to launch a devastating attack against Egypt with this, is that attack would be considered maybe not necessary, let alone disproportional. And self-defense is supposed to be necessary and proportional with relation to the attack that is occurring. So while this at first sight to the non-informed international lawyer may seem a very clear case of a violation of right, an act of war which might be interpreted to constitute an armed attack, because force may be used, or force is threatened at least, to stop ships from going through the Strait of Tiran, and thus triggering the right of self-defense, this is not such a clear-cut case, certainly not in terms of proportion. And that is something that people on the news understand. Blocking two ships with oil to sail through here and doing a massive attack on 80,000 Egyptian troops in the Sinai doesn't seem to be very manifestly proportionate. That is something, of course, that the television watchers over the world would easily understand. So for the Israeli politicians, it's immediately clear that if they would want to go to war over this, this is not necessarily enough to have that kind of war in which they would pressure their advantage and really beat their enemies so that for the next 10, 20 years, Israel might be safe from that. Because that is in the end, I should have stressed that maybe earlier, Israeli concern. If we go to war, this time we should have enough time and the war should be big enough for us to press our military advantage that on paper we have to make that material so that for the next 10, 20, 30 years they won't dare to attack us at the time of their relative strength and our relative weakness again, to make us more secure long term. That is, in the end, the calculation that the High Command in Tel Aviv is making. To wrap this all up, how does Israel move towards the war with all the calculations made? Well, first of all, both the governments, which is led by this man, Eshkol, Levi Eshkol, both the governments of Israel and the military high command under the leadership of Rabin, who Eshkol brings in Dayan as Minister of Defense. He's retired at that time. They bring in the government at the time in May to become Minister of Defense under the threat of these events, of this escalation. They first of all calculate that the closure of the Strait of Tiran, the withdrawal of United Nations peacekeepers, is not that important in itself. That itself does not constitute an enormous threat to Israel. The invasion, or the deployment better, on their own territory of 50 to 80,000, the Israelis estimate 100 to 150,000, but they know that's not true. The deployment of 50 to 80,000 Egyptian troops, crack Egyptian troops, tank armors, brigades and so on, in the Sinai. By the way, the Israeli army and its maximum mobilization at the time was 280,000. Of course, that is a 1-to-2 disadvantage if you count the full Egyptian army, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq and Syria. But on the battlefield, Israel will have an advantage of 280 against a small 200,000, maybe even 150,000. That in itself is not also assessed to be a very big threat, because the Israeli army themselves say the troops have dug themselves into defensive positions. They are there to deter us from an attack on Syria, but they are not supposed to attack us immediately, those Egyptian troops. Yet the calculation, particularly the political calculation, is if Israel allows this to happen, if Israel allows Egypt to make this threatening move and to block the Strait of Tiran, then it will be read as a sign of weakness on the Israeli part. It will lose its support from its Western allies because it becomes less useful in the balance of power fight over the Middle East between the United States and the Soviet Union. And long term, it will encourage the Arabs to attack it at the time of their strength and a time of Israeli weakness. So they can simply, in their calculation, political calculation, in terms of the credibility of their deterrence capacity, not allow this to stand, not allow this to happen. Secondly, and this is mostly Dayan and Rabin, more than the government speaking, so this is the military actually speaking most of all, and some diplomats around that, they think that Nasser has made blunders. Nasser has made enormous mistakes because he has created a window of opportunity for the Israelis to attack. So they were very clear about that, and that are the sources that have been opened over the last years. In their calculations, they say, Nasser is not going to attack us, he doesn't dare, but he seems to be set on attacking us, and this is an opportunity for us to basically allow him, provoke him even more, and then maybe massively retaliate with a massive attack. From the 22nd of May onwards, so 2 weeks before the war, the military high command of Israel pressures the government, tries to convince the government to launch a massive attack on Egypt and Syria, not on Jordan, on Egypt, and particularly Egypt and Syria, to press the advantage, but under the condition that the politicians can take care of the fact that they will get 5 to 10 days to do the job. In other words, the politicians need to talk to Washington, to President Johnson, so that Johnson more or less promises that he will not move for a quick condemnation of Israel in the Security Council, let alone for American sanctions, American reprisals against Israel. And of course, they need assurance that the United States, Britain and France, which have delivered most of Israeli weaponry or need to approvision Israel with ammunition during the war, will still sell them arms during those days of the war. In other words, they need more to launch that attack than just these calculations. They need some indulgence, at least, and the active selling of arms on the side of the three major Western powers before they can launch this attack. If you look at the sources, what the Israelis invest most in these days before the war is in sending massive amounts of emissaries to Washington, to Paris, to London, in particular to other countries, including to Brussels, in Belgium, to try to sound out the governments how they would react in case there would be a war, and in case the war would be started with the first shots being shot on the Israeli side. The reply they everywhere get, particularly in Washington and London, is take care that you are not the first to shoot. If you launch the war, we will not support you. So they never get a very clear signal that the United States will condone an offensive war or anticipatory war by Israel. But there is enough fog being created about the question whether the blocking of the Tyrant Strait in itself does not suffice. This fog is particularly created by the British, because the British want to forestall war by trying to conjure up an alliance of the willing and to get it approved by the United Nations Security Council to send an international fleet, well, little fleet, flotilla, into the Strait of Tiran to open the blockade, or to escort Israeli merchant ships, or to escort foreign ships who would want to sell or import oil into Israel, or weapons even into Israel through the Straits of Eilat. The British mean well, but by doing that, they of course strengthen the case that the blockade might be enough to say that this is an armed attack and that Israel has a right for self-defense. In the end, I cannot explain it in detail in a few minutes, but in the end what happens is the creation of confusion. Creation of confusion whereby even to Lyndon Johnson himself, who is set on stopping a war between Israel and Egypt at the beginning, it isn't very clear anymore what his own position is. In the end, the United States does not give a clear signal, an unequivocal signal to Israel that if you attack, we will condemn you for aggression and we will stop you in your tracks and will not sell you arms. In the end, this is not the message that Washington sends to Israel. At some lower level, the undersecretary level, the deputy level of secretaries of state and the Pentagon, there are even some signals sent to Tel Aviv, particularly in Tel Aviv when an important American visits there, to tell them the opposite, to tell them in the end that if they can do it quickly, if they can attack and win within a few days, the United States might buy them time. And this is enough. Well, on the 28th of May, the Israeli cabinet votes on the question whether they will launch a war against Egypt or not. The 28th of May, they vote, and it is 12-12. Votes block. 4 days later, or 5 days later, they take the vote again, and on this occasion, a 2/3 majority votes, or 60% majority votes for the war. What's the difference between the 28th of May and the 4th of June? The American position has become even more confused. And this is enough for Israel to estimate, we might indeed get the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 days we need. We have enough support in Washington to blur the lines and to forestall a quick condemnation in the Security Council of our position. What I suspect, but this is my conjecture, I need to go deeper into the sources, is that Israel pushed the United States of bringing this as openly as possible into the United Nations Security Council. That Israel was much in favor of bringing the debate as quickly as possible into the United Nations Security Council to get it blocked. Why? Because they estimated that if there would be a United Nations Security Council debate in which the Soviet Union would virulently attack Israel, the United States would be more inclined not to follow that line. While if the United States was left on its own in Washington to decide its position outside of the Cold War, it might actually come out with a much quicker condemnation itself. Secondly, Israel, and that is what I'm certain of, estimated that the quicker the debate in the United Nations Security Council, the less information about what happened on the ground, the more confusion, the more uncertainty about whom shot first. And in the end, this worked. To cut a very long story short, this is exactly what happened, as I will explain later. The rest is history. In terms of the war, on the 5th of June, Israel's Air Force attacks the Egyptian Air Force, destroys most of it on the ground and some of it in the air. Israel attacks Syria's Air Force, again destroys most of it on the ground and in the air. The same time when the Air Force launches its attack, Israeli troops launch their attack on the Egyptian troops in the Sinai Desert, win a brilliant tank battle victory in the Sinai Desert. They also push then against Syria over the Golan Heights. Jordan is loyal and stupid enough, you may say, to start artillery barrages from the West Bank into Israel. Israel uses this as an opportunity to attack the West Bank and conquer Jerusalem where Rabbi Moshe Dayan and the local general enter through the Lions Gate here in the old city of Jerusalem, conquering it, and until this day, of course, occupying it or have annexed it. Also, the Gaza Strip, which is administered by Egypt, is occupied. By the way, another event that happened just before the Israeli decision is the alliance treaty between Jordan and Egypt, under which the Jordan troops were put under the high command of the Egyptian troops in case of war, which Israel, of course, saw as another occasion to sell towards its allies that Egypt and Syria were about to attack. But this is all political. This is not a legal claim. This is the political claim they are making. Israel has indeed tried to sell the war to Israel, Britain and France by saying, we feel that they have attacked us by closing the Strait of Tiran. They have attacked us by sending troops into the Sinai, or they're on the verge of attacking us, so we need to make a preventive move. But they do not make that a legal claim. They make that as a political claim, indeed, and they make that in private, not in public. It is only after 1972 that the first documents will be opened, and that we will know that this has been the Israeli diplomacy's tactic towards particularly the United States, Britain and France in the run-up of the war. I don't have time to say anything about that, except that the Soviets were also very much involved in trying to stop the war by threatening Israel, by threatening the United States, that this might escalate into World War III, which of course did nothing to disengage the United States from Israel. It actually drove the United States and Israel into one another's arms. This quite aggressive stance by the Soviet Union that they would escalate this into World War III if the Americans condoned it. That backfired, so that certainly didn't help the doves in the American administration. Before we go to the break, let me then move into a very short crack course in self-defense under international law. The seminal text to understand international law and the use of force is the United Nations Charter of 1945, which in its most ambitious paragraph, Article 2, Paragraph 4, basically outlaws the use of force between states. It prohibits the resort to force or the threat of force between states. It is the most ambitious, most far-reaching attempt by mankind to outlaw force between states, interstate force. This not only stretches to full wars, but also to more limited uses of force, like a limited act of reprisal. There's an attack by a small, there's a border incident by Syrians shooting on Israelis shooting back the day after. That is not a war, that is a limited use of force in peacetime, what we call a measure short of war in international law speech. Self-defense is the same. Self-defense doesn't need to be a full war. Self-defense may be a limited, proportional reaction against an occurring armed attack, which stops the moment the attack stops. 100 Hezbollah infiltrate Galilee in the north of Israel in 2006. Israelis shoot back, they move over the border. If the Israelis stopped, that is a literal interpretation of a limited exercise of the right of self-defense. Israel doesn't stop in 2006, it's launched a major invasion of Lebanon. That makes it, not legally technically speaking, but under the old law, a war. A war which was started by the other side, so a war in defense. But in the end, then it's a full-blown war. Simply said, international law since 1945 makes all these actions illegal. War is illegal and force is illegal, with two exceptions. And these exceptions are found in the so-called famous chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, which is entitled Action with respect to threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. That is the chapter that gives the United Nations Security Council a monopoly power, a complete discretionary power over action that needs to be taken in the cases of the threat or the breach of international peace and security. This is a very far-reaching discretionary power. Originally 11, later 15 member states, 5 of them permanent, 10 elected per 2 years, are delegated the power by the world community that in case of a breach or a threat to international peace and security, they assume a monopoly power of dealing with this issue, with this incident, with this crisis, in the name of the international community, and can take far-reaching measures to deal with the crisis. The power even goes further than this. I'm not going to go into the articles in detail now, but Article 39 reads and is interpreted as follows: When is there an international crisis, a crisis of international peace and security? Well, it says that when there is such a crisis, the United Nations Security Council takes over. That the United Nations Security Council can then take measures. The crucial legal question then becomes is, when is there, what is an international crisis? When does that power apply? The answer is when the United Nations Security Council says so. So the United Nations Security Council decides itself what constitutes an international crisis and triggers its competence. That is an enormous power. That is an unseen delegation of power by the 200 states of the world to the 5 permanent powers and 10 others. Which of course could only be made in the context in which the United Nations emerged, which is the end of World War II, when the coalition of the 3 winners called the shots. The United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain. It wouldn't be possible, I think, in any other context to write an article like that and interpret it like that. There's 2 exceptions to the prohibition to resort to force in international law. First, Article 42, that says that in case of a violation of a threat to international security, the United Nations Security Council can take measures to manage the crisis, including the use of force. So the United Nations Security Council can itself resort to force to stop an aggression, to stop a war, or to do anything which it measures to be necessary to deal with a threat or a violation of international peace and security. At the time, it was intended that the United Nations Security Council would develop its own institutions, with basically its own army, its own command structure, drawing upon the actual forces of national states, but forces which would be pre-dedicated to the United Nations Security Council. In other words, the United States, Soviet Union would say, so many ships, so many planes, so many divisions are yours, and if you need them, you call them up, and your generals command them. That never happened. There would never be an effective institutionalization of the use of force by the United Nations under Article 42. What happened later, after the Cold War, is that the United Nations Security Council started to authorize, to allow states to use force under Article 42. The first clear indication of that, example of that, is the Korean War, more or less clear, of 1950, and somewhat clearer example of that is the Kuwait crisis of 1990, 23 years after the 6 Days War. The other exception is self-defense. But before I go there, self-defense was considered to be the exception to the rule. Rule 1 was that states would not resort to force. Rule 2 was that if states resorted to force anyway, the United Nations Security Council would deal with them by diplomatic sanctions, by economic sanctions, by military force. If that did not work, or did not work in time, then you could fall back on self-defense. That's the logic of the whole charter and the logic of the negotiations behind it. The problem with that was, of course, that during the Cold War, the United Nations Security Council didn't function because of the veto and because of the fact that the world got divided in 2 camps, and that any conflict in which the United States supported A, the Soviet Union would support B, and the other way around, which led to the massive use in the first 25 years of the Soviet veto, and later when the Soviets and its communist allies and the non-aligned movement gained the majority of votes, mostly the American, British or French veto from the 1970s, 1980s onwards. So the United Nations Security Council for a large period of time, simply put, didn't work, allowing the third strap of the third sports of the ladder in the cascade, or the third waterfall, to function, self-defense. Being the other exception to use force by default. When states resort to force anyway, when there are international crises, and when the United Nations Security Council is powerless to deal with them, then states can resort to self-defense or to force under Article self-defense, under certain conditions. And this makes, of course, self-defense, particularly during the Cold War, but by the way, even more so afterwards, crucial to the texture of international law with relation to the use of force. Let's have a break now for 10 minutes maybe, until 1:15, and then move back to the crisis. Okay, we're all more or less back. The camera too. Let me delve a little bit deeper, don't panic, non-lawyers among you, into Article 51. by drawing your attention to mainly the fact that when the authors of Charter wrote in Article 51, the author of that was actually Arthur Vandenberg, a Republican senator from the United States, who was on the United States delegation during the negotiations. And the intention of bringing in Article 51 was the fact that the American states, so the Latin American states and the United States, had just signed a defensive pact among them, and that the Arab League, just founded in 1945, also included a defensive article in the statute or in the charter of the Arab League, saying that if one of the states was attacked, this would lead to the other states defending the attacked states. So it was felt that they needed some kind of provision for these kind of multilateral defensive pacts. France was also very much in favor of that because France hoped to gain a defensive alliance with Britain and with the United States in case of a new German attack in the future. So they wrote in Article 51, self-defense exception, into the Charter that says, and it clearly voices this as an exception, nothing in the present Charter shall impair, prevent the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense. Nothing shall impair. So this will not take away the existing right of self-defense, which is inherent. In French it says le droit naturel, the natural law, which is inherent to human nature itself. The Charter does not create the right of self-defense, it is there. And it remains there. It doesn't restrict it. But it doesn't create it. It predates it. It's a right of individual or collective self-defense. You can defend yourself or your allies. If an armed attack occurs, question in the American Senate to Senator Vandenberg, does this mean that the attack already has to have started? Answer of Senator Vandenberg, the author of this, yes, it does mean that. So to the author of this text, it is in no doubt that anticipatory self-defense is not allowed. It could have said when an armed attack has occurred, that would even be clearer, but the word armed attack and occurred is enough indeed to lead to the logical interpretation that an act of defense in anticipation of an attack is not allowed until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security, and the rest of the article says that when a state exercises the right of self-defense, it needs to alert the Security Council and it needs to follow the instructions of the Security Council with relation to the execution of its rights of self-defense, which needs to be interpreted as if the United Nations Security Council takes measures, the self-defending state may do nothing to impede these measures. It doesn't necessarily have to stop its self-defense, but it needs to work together with the United Nations Security Council. To sum this up in political rather than legal terms, but also in the end in legal terms, you have to think of the collective security mechanism of the United Nations Security Council that will take measures to manage a crisis and self-defense as communicative vessels. The more effective the collective security mechanism of the United Nations Security Council is, the less room for self-defense. The quicker, the more effective the United Nations Security Council deals with international crises, the less room there is for self-defense. The less effective the collective security mechanism of the Council is, the more leeway and room there is for self-defense. And to summarize history in 2 sentences, since then, or at least during the Cold War, because the Security Council after 1950 was completely inactive in terms of the management of important international crises, states had to fend for themselves. They had only one legal excuse to resort to war, Article 51. So after 1950, when states resorted to war, in the more than 300 cases that happened, in the more than 300 cases that occurred before the Security Council, in almost 100% of the cases, both sides claimed to act in self-defense. So both sides would generally say, he started, to put it mildly, or he was about to start. That would be anticipatory self-defense. Actually, there is not a single case in the Cold War wherein the state said he was about to start, except the Israeli bombing of Iraq in 1981. But that is long after 1967. I will briefly get back to that case at the end of this period. So that is very briefly the law. And that is also what happens with the law. After 1950, when the United Nations Security Council goes into a permanent state of, or semi-permanent state of hibernation, it's winter sleep, it's beauty sleep during the winter of the Cold War, states need to fend for themselves and do that by extensively interpreting the doctrine of self-defense. One push they make, which is very important, is to say that they have a right to use force after an attack has occurred. For instance, there is a bombing by Iran against Iraq in 1980. Iraq says, after the bombing has happened, we can retaliate by bombing back. This is generally condoned as long as it happens proportional. So there's 10 guns shooting 5 times on one side, there's 10 guns shooting 5 times on the other side. Most states say, okay, this is not what is meant under the article, but this also have a value because it deters a new attack in the future. Or maybe do a little bit more violence. By the way, Israel will lead the way here. Israel, particularly in dealing with Fatah and other Palestinian attacks and terrorism in the 60s, 70s and 80s, will very extensively use a doctrine of reprisal. Reprisal is actually the use of force after a violation of rights or after an armed attack, under the guise of self-defense. It is a standard Israeli doctrine that they retaliate against any use of force against Israel in a proportional way. Meaning that they will use a measure of more force than the attack. They will double, triple the attack, but there's even a kind of proportionality in the disproportion. So they will not double it by 1,000 or manifold it by 1,000. If so much Israeli property is destroyed, we'll destroy so much more property, but not indeterminate. At least that is the doctrine. But they do it under self-defense. Now, in the context of the 1966-1967 crisis, when Israel invades the West Bank in November 1966 to retaliate against the landmine killing 3 Israeli soldiers, the United Nations Security Council, in a unanimous vote, with the vote of the United States, censures Israel for this large-scale military action in violations of the Charter, emphasizes to Israel that actions of military reprisal cannot be tolerated. In other words, that they are not self-defense. So here we still have a very strict interpretation of the fact that self-defense stops the moment the attack stops. Let alone that nobody would condone that self-defense begins before the attack begins, because that's even a bridge further. Why is that a bridge further? There is certainty that you have been attacked when you retaliate against the past attack. There is no certainty that you're going to be attacked when you prevent an imminent attack that you think is going to happen, that you claim is going to happen. So that is in bigger leap of faith than retaliation for evidence reasons, for proof reasons. Let's go then to what happened in the United Nations Security Council between the 5th of June and the end of 1967, when the debate was more or less frozen. I wouldn't say closed, it's still not closed. The United Nations Security Council is permanently seized by the matter, meaning the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So the debate never closes in the United Nations Security Council. But at some point it reached a kind of calm after the war. The very first day of the attack, Egypt and Israel both themselves call a meeting of the United Nations Security Council. Other states do too, but they call a meeting. Because both claim that they are exercising the right of self-defense under Article 51, and thus they shall immediately report to the Security Council that they are acting in self-defense. So both take the logic of Article 51, call a meeting, send their ambassador and make a statement. The Israeli ambassador, in the 2 meetings that happened that day, says in the very early morning, while in the very first hours, literally hour, singular, of the attack, I have just received reports that Egyptian land and air forces have moved against Israel, and Israeli forces are now engaged in repelling the Egyptian forces. From these attacks, it is evident that in the early hours of this morning, Egyptian armored columns moved in an offensive thrust against Israel's borders. At the same time, Egyptian planes took off from airfields in Sinai and struck out towards Israel. Egyptian artillery in the Gaza shelled the Israeli villages of Kisufim and so on and so forth. Netanya and Kefayavetz have also been bombed. So the Israelis claim self-defense on what basis? That they have been attacked. They claim that Egypt have sent in troops over the border, or moved them towards the border, that planes have been launched towards Israel, and that their artillery has actually bombed 5 or 6 villages. Interestingly, When the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel the next day speaks in the United Nations Security Council in New York, he lists another list of villages. He misses 3 out of the 6, and all of a sudden other villages have been bombed by the Egyptian artillery, which doesn't necessarily make it untrue. The fact of the matter is, as Israel knew well, as Washington knew full well, as everybody knew full well, by the end of the day, that there had been no Egyptian attack at all. That this was just a cooked up story. But legally it tells an interesting story. Legally it tells a story that Israel did not claim anticipatory self-defense, and that Israel did not consider the block of the Tiran Strait to suffice for a legal defense that would at least serve the purpose that Israel wanted it to serve. From the sources, it's very clear that Israel did not hope to win the legal fight in the United Nations Security Council. It estimated that it might lose the legal fight, that it had a fat chance of being condemned for this massive attack on Egypt and then later on Syria. It just wanted to win time. It just wanted to kick up enough desert sand, enough dust, enough confusion about the facts, for if the United States and Britain would prove willing to veto a resolution and to conjure up diplomatic supports to stop a condemnation, to win time. They just hope to create confusion for 3, 4, 5, 6 days, enough to win the war. And for that, they blatantly lied. By the way, there are other instances of that in history which were less credible. For instance, when Germany declared war upon France in the 2nd of August 1914, Germany also claimed that France had shelled and bombed German villages over the border, which then in a few weeks later they retracted because it wasn't true. That has often happened in history. Here it was a bit more credible because the international community, and particularly the international press, believed indeed that Egypt was on the verge of attacking because it had built up its forces in the Sinai and so on and so forth. Egypt, of course, claims the opposite. Israel has committed a treacherous, premeditated aggression against the United Arab Republic, that is the name of Egypt at the time, this morning. The Israelis launched attacks against the Gaza Strip, Sinai, airports in Cairo, the Suez Canal area, and several other airports within the Egyptian Republic. Preliminary reports indicate that 23 Israel airplanes have been shot down and that several Israel pilots have been captured. It's rather 2.3 airplanes than 23. That's the, by the way, a little anecdote. In the Yom Kippur War, a few years later, when the OPEC is blocking the oil exports towards Europe, Kissinger, the then Pope of Foreign Policy of the United States, flies to Alexandria, Cairo to negotiate with the Saudis and the Egyptians about relaxing this oil blockade or oil boycott against the West, while still allowing for the United States to sell and give arms and ammunition to Israel. And they reached an agreement between Kissinger and the Vice President of Egypt at the time that Egypt will not sanction the United States as long as it does not give or sell more planes and tanks and ships and guns to Israel than Egypt has destroyed. So that it doesn't overarm Israel during the war, but only rearms Israel to the extent of the Egyptian destruction. Then, of course, a clever diplomat asked the question, but how will we know how many Israeli tanks, airplanes have been destroyed by the Egyptians? And Kissinger says, no problem, I'll listen to the Egyptian radio and I will take those numbers. Which, of course, the Egyptians panic about because they do everything per 10 or per 20 in their reports. This as a small anecdote to the side. So we have a classical case here of both, like boys on the playground. Boys start to fight on the playground, or a boy and a girl, doesn't matter. And the teacher comes in and he says, who started? And we'll say, he or she started. That's basically what's happening here at high-level diplomacy. What does it do? It does what it needs to do. The same day, the United States gives out a statement. Each side has accused the other of launching aggression. At this time, the facts are not clear. It does the trick. It conjures up, or it kicks up enough sand for anybody who wants to hide behind the sand to do so, and everybody wants to do so, except the staunchest enemies of Israel, being the Arab states itself and their close ally at the time, the Soviet Union, and of course its Eastern European allies. Everybody falls in line. The Western countries, the non-aligned countries, neutral countries, They all fall in line. Actually, many of them send a representative into the Security Council debate. Security Council only has 15 members, but all members may participate in the debates. They may not vote. And they basically all hide for 2-3 days behind the cloud that Israel and Egypt have kicked up by saying he started it, so that they do not have to choose sides. Later international lawyers will read this as sympathy for the Israeli position, because later international lawyers will know that this is a blatant lie on the Israeli side, and they will read this as sympathy for the Israeli position, saying that Israel was probably threatened by an Egyptian-Syrian attack, and it forestalled that, and we can understand that because Israel is a tiny country, and if an attack is successfully launched, it might not be stopped anymore. As it would be proven with the Yom Kippur War, when Egypt then launches its surprise attack 60 years later against Israel in the Yom Kippur War, Israel almost loses that war within dozens of minutes, basically, or hours. And then it starts to mobilize quickly enough, stops the attack and counterattack. But if the surprise had just been a little bit bigger in 1973, Israel might have been driven, the Israeli army might have been driven literally into the sea within a matter of hours. So international lawyers with some military background here often read this as sympathy for the Israeli position, later translating this into sympathy for anticipatory self-defense. But I cannot stress enough that Israel didn't claim anticipatory self-defense. Why not? Because it had claimed that politically. It had gone to Washington and London and Paris said, we are about to be attacked. Now the Americans knew that it was not true. The Americans read the Egyptian movements as being defensive. The Soviets read the Egyptian movements as being defensive. The French, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Italians, everybody with information on the ground or in the air read the Egyptian move as being defensive. But they felt, like Israel, that Nasser had blundered. By trying to deter Israel from an attack on Israel, by sending these troops in the desert, by withdrawing United Nations peacekeepers, by blocking the Strait of Tiran, he all did this to seem strong, to seem as if he would attack Israel. And Israel basically called his bluff, but not by saying you're not going to attack, by saying you're going to attack, so we're going to attack you first. And there was indeed enough sympathy in London, Paris, and Washington for Israel to condone this, particularly in London and Washington. This is actually the 6 Days War, the moment that Paris veers away from its traditional alliance with Israel and moves towards the Arab world. This is actually the turning point in French tradition from a pro-Israeli ally to a pro-Arab state in the Cold War. But that's completely aside, of course. Here. So this is the, let's say, the successful offensive of Israel in the United Nations Security Council. The next day, a vote is taken on a resolution, which is in the end tabled by the Western, or put on the table by Western countries. And the resolution, as you can see, is pretty weak. The United Nations Security Council is concerned at the outbreak of fighting and with the menacing situation in the Near East. Later redubbed the Middle East, but at that time, sometimes still the Near East. It is concerned at the outbreak of fighting and with the menacing situation. What doesn't it do? For the lawyers among you, it doesn't call this a threat or a violation of international peace and security. It does not use the language of Article 39 of Chapter 7. If it would have used this language, it would have indicated that it triggers its own powers of collective security, which would allow it to take enforceable measures against Egypt, Syria, and Israel. By not using that language, it holds back from actually claiming that it can take measures. Enforceable measures. Legally binding measures. So it doesn't want to do that. As in the Cold War, it would very seldom do that. To illustrate it with one blatantly spectacular example, you all know about the Iran-Iraq war that lasted from 1980 to 1988, that caused 1.5 million casualties, and that mobilized millions of troops together at both sides. It costed United Nations Security Council 7 years to call that a breach of international peace and security. They took 7 years to take a vote to say that this was a war in normal terms, because they didn't want to trigger their own legal competition, so they should not do anything, except call for peace and call for the end of hostilities, which is the same as this resolution does, calls upon the governments concerned to take forthwith as a first step all measures for an immediate ceasefire and a cessation of military activities in the area. It calls upon all fighting sides to stop fighting. It doesn't say Israel has to stop first because it launched first. It doesn't point a finger at anybody. It stays completely neutral between the sides. Which is, of course, often the only thing the United Nations Security Council can do in the context of the Cold War and its veto. With the exception of Israel, the only states, together with Israel, that during the Cold War got condemned from time to time for aggression or the first use of military force was Israel and South Africa. South Africa because of the fact that in the Cold War, the West and the East could generally unite about the project of decolonization and against apartheid. Apartheid was one of the few things that tied together the West and the rest during the Cold War, even if South Africa was a Western ally and Angola and others were Soviet allies at some point. And the other was Israel. But here even Israel is successful in avoiding a condemnation of its action, which is not self-evident if you look back to this resolution, where for much less it was condemned just 6 months before. 4 days later, when Israel had as much as won the war, when Jordan had pleaded the ceasefire, when Syria had pleaded the ceasefire, when the Egyptians were standing with their arms waving in the desert near Cairo, when the war was done, then finally a resolution is voted with the support of the United States that goes further. Affirm that its demands for a ceasefire and the discontinuance of all military activities includes prohibitions of any forward military movements subsequent to the ceasefire. Calls for the prompt return to the ceasefire positions of any troops which may have moved forward to 4:30 p.m. on the 10th of June 1967. In other words, calls for a stop, a ceasefire, and a stop of forward movements, in this case by Israeli troops. It doesn't call for withdrawal of the troops to the borders of the 5th of June. So it doesn't say that Israel, that has occupied the West Bank, the Gaza, the Sinai, the Golan, has to withdraw from that at the time in this resolution. This resolution was based on a Soviet proposal that had been put on the table on the 8th of June, the 4th day of the war. It was voted upon, that resolution, and that resolution indicated Israel as the aggressor. There was a separate vote on this part of the resolution to indicate Israel as the aggressor, which only gained one vote, that of the Soviet Union. There was a separate vote on a clause that said that Israel had to withdraw its troops to the ceasefire lines, the international ceasefire lines of 1949, so before its attack of the 5th of June, that also gained 2 votes out of 15. Then the Soviet Union brought the case before the General Assembly in July, that also took a vote on these 2 clauses, and there was vast majorities rejecting them or abstaining. So the majority of states indeed refused to condemn Israel for aggression, refused to say that Israel had acted illegally in committing self-defense. The logic of that is, if the attack or if the Israeli military action is illegal, all the consequences are also illegal. So if you would say that the Israeli action is illegal, the occupation of Jerusalem, Gaza, Sinai, Golan and West Bank is also illegal. And that would not trigger the applications of the law of occupation, the laws of temporary occupation. That doesn't mean annexation, that doesn't mean that they become part of Israel. But there is, under the Geneva Conventions, a law of occupation that says that when in a legitimate struggle, a state occupies territory, it has to administer that territory under the laws of occupation. So the occupation itself would become illegal if the self-defense of Israel claim would be rejected. These votes, of course, many international lawyers have said that these votes indicate, and the debates around them, that the states of the world supported Israel's claim for anticipatory self-defense. Again, this is a fluke, because first, Israel didn't claim to act as anticipatory self-defense, and secondly, nobody motivated its votes by referring to anticipatory self-defense. Moreover, nobody said that Israel acted in self-defense. They only refused to condemn Israel for not acting in self-defense. To the non-lawyers of you, this may seem sophistry. It is, of course, but to the lawyers, it is what we do. This kind of sophistry. So this makes all potential sense, and it's very strange that so few international lawyers, because these texts has always been public, and on the internet for many years now, have not read it in this way. Most states in the end have fallen in line with the explanation of the Americans why they did not vote for condemnation and why they did not vote for the immediate withdrawal of Israel from the newly occupied territories. I won't read it out, it would take too much time, but it basically argues here, the American president argues here, that they do not want to take a position on this particular issue of who acted in self-defense and whether the occupation is legal or not, because that would only hamper a more general negotiation about a peace between Israel and its neighbors. So the political line is, let's not take partial positions, let's not say this was right and this was wrong, because this would only lead to disequality between the parties who need basically, with an open mind, with open hands, with an open agenda, to come to the negotiation table to solve everything at the same time. So let's not predispose certain positions that might hamper the negotiations. Of course, in terms of negotiation strategy and diplomacy, this makes sense. In terms of the law, it means basically the politicians saying to the law, keep silent about the law because it will only hamper the solution at the diplomatic level of the peace process. This solution, whatever you may think about it, is also enshrined in the very famous Resolution 242 of the Security Council. You often, when you follow the Middle Eastern political conflict, often still read today references to Resolution 242 and 338. These are the resolutions that came out of the 6 Days War and the Yom Kippur War, and they basically say the same. The material paragraph for us, they basically today, when you see reference today, which will mostly be done by Palestinian or Arab politicians, to 242 and 338, it is the endorsement of the United Nations Security Council that Israel should release the occupied territories and return to the borders of 1949. So that Israel should give up all the territories that it conquered here on this map. That is what it says today in political terms. What does the resolution say in legal terms for our purposes? The Security Council affirms that the fulfillment of Charter principles requires the establishment of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. So our goal should not be a condemnation of Israel or Egypt for the war. Our primary goal is a just and lasting peace, which includes the application of both the following principles. And this is interesting. Both the following principles indicates that these principles are connected, that you can only have peace if the two principles are adhered to. It's not a choice making, it's both or not. Withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. Termination of all claims on states of legitimacy and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area. The Israel reading, but it's a legally orthodox reading of this, is that Israel only has to release the territories it conquered in 1967 if the other states recognize Israel and secure its security. This is the Israeli reading. This is not how it was meant by most states who voted for the resolution, but they stupidly phrased it like that. So they gave Israel on a platter a textual interpretation that these two are connected. It was not intended so, not even by the American lawyers who wrote it. They made a mistake in writing it like that. But this is the legal consequence in the end of the war. There is no condemnation of Israel being the aggressor. There's no condemnation of Egypt being the aggressor. But because the facts speak against Israel, this has given support to the idea that Israel's position gained more sympathy and more legal support than Egypt's position, which can only derive from the fact that Egypt made such threatening moves that it became credible, that it made a credible threat that it would attack. And that conjured up the idea or created the idea that Israel probably genuinely believed that it would be attacked. Until 2011-12, most international lawyers and most historians believed that Rabin and others believed that they would be attacked. After 2002, Israel and America opened their archives, and it appeared that they did not believe that. But they only acted as if they believed that. Yet they did not want to use it as a legal argument because they knew there would not be support for the legal argument. Although they knew that most states believed their claim that Egypt was about to attack, they didn't use it as a legal argument because there is no right of anticipatory self-defense. But in a kind of reversal of guesswork, you might say, international lawyers later said, because apparently the states of the world legally supported the fact that Israel was not an aggressor, they must have supported anticipatory self-defense. Thus, they believe there is a right of anticipatory self-defense, which is an air castle built on nothing but desert sand, shifting desert sand in the end. So this is, let's say, the big mistake of international lawyers writing about this, but it is an understandable mistake because of how it rolled out. Did it roll out? How did it roll out in terms of the claim by Israel that Egypt had attacked Israel? Israel made the claim on the 5th and the 6th of June that it had been attacked by Egypt. By the 7th of June, it stopped saying that and it said nothing. The 7th of July, Prime Minister Eshkol made an important speech in the Knesset in which he said that Israel had launched a war because of the fact that Egypt had blocked the Strait of Tiran. Yet, they did not yet make the claim of anticipatory self-defense. They would only make that claim when in 1972 they opened the documents which proved that Israel was trying to convince the Americans, the British and the French that there was an Egyptian threat. And then in 2010-11 they opened documents that showed that while they were claiming that, they didn't believe it themselves. So that is, let's say, also the role of the historian and the role of opening documents that rewrites history as we know more and more about this conflict. If I would have been saying this 20 years ago, I would certainly have, or write this clashed with Israeli scholars. Now most Israeli scholars actually accept what I'm telling today. So this is not really contentious, or that contentious anymore. But it played a role as a legal precedent, even if it was a false legal precedent. Another very important case of anticipatory self-defense is the 1981 case I already briefly referred to. In 1981, in the second year of the Iranian-Iraqi war, the Israel Air Force, using American Eagles, F-15 fighter planes or bomber planes, bombed the Iraqi nuclear facilities at Osirak, which allegedly was used as a production facility or a research and production facility for the development of nuclear bombs in Iraq. This is not anticipatory self-defense against an imminent attack. This Israel actually claimed to be an act of anticipatory self-defense, not against an imminent attack, but against a development that threatened its security in a vital and mortal way. If Iraq would develop nuclear weapons, it would change the balance of power in the Middle East. It would neutralize, of course, the actual nuclear deterrent by Israel, and the underlying claim was there would be new major wars in the Middle East, because Israel was claiming at the time that after the Yom Kippur War, when Israel made it clear that the next time it would use its nuclear weapons, there were no major wars against Israel anymore. That was the claim it was making. So the political claim underlying this was that. That didn't help Israel. The Security Council in 1981 unanimously condemned Israel for aggression in the most blatant of ways. But behind the doors, many diplomats, including the Soviet diplomats, tapped Israel on the fingers, or on the fingers, on the shoulders, well done. Including, of course, the Saudis, the Iranians, and so on, and so forth. So if this is a precedent, it's a precedent that indeed, again, shows that there's no support for a doctrine of, in this case, preventive self-defense. Self-defense against a slowly emerging form of threat. The whole debate about anticipatory self-defense would be revived in the context of 9/11, the war on terror, and then particularly the Bush Doctrine of 2002. What is the Bush Doctrine? Bush Jr. in this case, the president who oversaw the beginning of the war on terror between 2001 and 2009. The Bush Doctrine is a doctrine which says that the greatest threat to the United States and its allies is the potential combination of international terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. Is the fact that weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, nuclear weapons, might fall into the hands of Al-Qaeda and other international terrorist groups, and might thus lead to great humanitarian disasters, and that the United States has a right to forestall this by any necessary means, including the use of anticipatory self-defense against these organizations or against the states harboring and sponsoring them, like for instance Taliban, Afghanistan, or allegedly at the time Saddam Hussein, Iraq, which was clearly not true because Saddam Hussein was certainly no friend to Al-Qaeda at the time. In that context, you get the real legal debates among international lawyers about anticipatory self-defense. And this is actually the first context in recent history where there's growing support for anticipatory self-defense. By the way, European Union security document of 2003 goes a long way in supporting the Bush Doctrine. While European politicians, including the Belgian Prime Minister, were falling over their own feet in condemning Bush, they were doing exactly the same thing, or almost exactly the same thing in terms of legal doctrine at the time. A most dangerous moment here, and that is the moment when Iraq and the 6 Days War are revived a lot in the literature, is when Kofi Annan, the then United Nations Secretary General, establishes the high-level panel to study and rewrite the Charter of the United Nations. Now, in one page, that high-level panel, which was chaired by Gary Evans, who was later the president of Human Rights or Crisis Watch, and was at that time the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Australia and an international lawyer, academic international lawyer in his own right, includes a page about anticipatory self-defense, where it says that the distinction has to be made between the defense against an imminent threat, which is called preemptive self-defense, and the defense against a long-term threat. So the 6 Days War as opposed to the Iraq case. An imminent attack, Egyptian planes about to launch, against Iraq developing a nuclear bomb in the next 5 or 10 years. And that according to that high-level panel, international lawyers and states generally accept preemptive self-defense but reject preventive self-defense. So all of a sudden, a high-level panel consisting of 22 former and important political leaders and international lawyers, in 2004, writes, without a shred of proof, without a footnote to sustain it, that international law accepts preemptive self-defense. And that the general practice of states supports this. Neither the one nor the other is true. There is no shred of proof brought to bear on this, but it also doesn't exist. If you read through hundreds of pages or thousands of pages of debates in the United Nations Security Council, there's never been a case in which states clearly supported a right to anticipatory self-defense. And the vast majority of international lawyers in their textbooks at best say that it is contested and generally rejected. The high-level panel did something very dangerous by saying defense against an imminent threat is generally accepted, defense against a far-off attack is not generally accepted, but it's also not necessary because in this case you have the time to go to the Security Council and ask for the Security Council to take measures. Now this is of course a very dangerous position, because what does it mean in practice? If you're, for instance, the President of the United States, and you think North Korea has nuclear bombs, well, we know that, and it might develop long-range missiles to attack Los Angeles or Chicago or even New York with them in the next 5 years. I better bomb them now before they can develop these weapons. Is this preemptive self-defense or preventive? Trump asks an international lawyer. Let's imagine for a moment that he would actually do that. He goes to the legal advice, the legal counsels in the White House, that he probably would do, and asks them for an advice. And you're a career-seeking lawyer, what would you do? You would say, Mr. President, it's probably preventive self-defense, so under the high-level panel reading it's illegal, but let's do as if it's preemptive self-defense, just bomb them, and you won't get condemned in the United Nations Security Council because you veto it. So first, it's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission, basically. Because as a veto holding power, it's better not to ask for permission. Because asking for permission means that any veto holding power can block you. But doing that, your veto suffices to escape condemnation. So this high-level panel document was a disaster. And fortunately, Kofi Annan understood that and put it away deeply in the drawer and buried it under a lot of ink and dust and never took it back out. And that was in the end of the great debate on anticipatory self-defense. From time to time it pops up, but less actually in legal practice than in legal academia. International lawyers who pride themselves on their staunch interpretations of international law often seem to be more relaxed about it than legal advisors of governments who are generally very loath to support anticipatory self-defense. Why? Because the facts are hard to prove, it only creates confusion, And what you can do today acts as a precedent for your opponents tomorrow. So it is something that governments and lawyers generally don't like, because it sometimes can be very useful, as in the case of Israel in 1967, to kick up the dust. But in the end, it doesn't make you more secure and safer. It makes any act of yourself which might threaten another an occasion for the other to claim that he can attack you. And maybe, as United States today, you shouldn't be worrying too much about that, but what in 10 or 20 years? When the United States might have an equal competitor in military force, for instance, in China. So generally, governmental lawyers and governmental diplomats are not so keen on this example of the 6 Days War. A final sentence about Israel. What Israel has been very successful in is claiming that reprisal, retaliation activities after the end of an attack can be self-defense. The best example of that is the war in Lebanon in 2006. Hezbollah agents infiltrate in Israel, kill and abduct 17 Israeli soldiers. Israel retaliates with a massive attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon. In the debates in the United Nations Security Council, very few states, even some Arab states, refrained from condemning Israel for aggression. Most states agreed that this was an act of self-defense. They only condemned Israel for acting disproportionately, to saying that the self-defense was too massive. But they didn't say that it was not self-defense because it took place after the attack. You might indeed say that somewhere in the 70s, 80s, and particularly after the Cold War, state practice and the United Nations Security Council practice indicates a relaxation of self-defense to include retaliating force after the attack, particularly in the context of the war on terror, which of course makes a lot of logical sense, you might say, because terror attacks are always surprise attacks. They are never announced, so you cannot really defend while they occur. That's a momentary explosion and it's over. So that makes of course sense. But also states, among others Israel, have benefited from this relaxation of the rules since then. And that's the end of my story. That doesn't leave much time for questions, but you could have interrupted me, but there's still some minutes for questions. Remarks, counterpoints. We're just tired after a long day. Okay, then I thank you for your attention, and I hope you'll enjoy the other lectures of this series, or my lectures, in my class. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm.